Okay, today's daf is Kaf Aleph. We're going to start at the top of Kaf Aleph actually. The first line of Kaf Aleph where it says Tanu Rabbanan. Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis taught Kol Elu Shamru in Madikin Behen B'Shabbat, Aval Osin Behen Midura, Ben Hitchamem Kenegda, Ben Lishtamish L'Ora. That any of these substances that one is not allowed to use for lighting candles on Shabbat, one can make a midura. You can make like a bonfire out of them. It's okay to make a larger fire, either to warm yourself or to use the light. Ben al gabe karka, ben al gabe kirat. On the stove or even on the ground, one can place these materials. The only thing that was prohibited was to make these a wick for a candle. In other words, if you were to take these substances that you're not allowed to use for wicks and you just put them in a pile and lit them on fire, everybody agrees they can burn. The problem is that they don't work very well as wicks to draw oil and to hold a flame. But they are flammable, so if you just threw them in a pile and made them into a fire, that would work. And so then, velo b'shemen kik, and we said in the Mishnah, shemen kik one cannot use. My shemen kik, what does it mean shemen kik? Amar Shmuel, shiltinu l'chol nechutei yama. We asked all of the seafarers, va'amruli, and they said to me, of echad yesh b'krachei hayam v'kik shemo, that there is an animal, a bird called the kik, meaning that this is an oil that's extracted from this bird. Rav Yitzchak Berei de Rav Yehuda Amar, Rav Yitzchak Berei de Rav Yehuda says, Mishchak de Kaza, that this is the oil that comes from cotton seeds. In other words, this is cottonseed oil. Reish Lakish Amar Kikayon de Yonah. It means the oil that comes from the Kikayon tree that we know from the story of Yonah. Amar Rabba Bar Chana. Rabba Bar Chana said, Ledidi Chazeli Kikayon de Yonah Velitzluliva Dame. And I saw the bush of the tree of Yonah from the story of Yonah, and it's like tzluliva. What does it translate that as? What kind of animal? What kind of thing is that?
Ricinus plant.
Okay, yeah, I don't know. It's some kind of
very thick or ricinus.
Okay, so it's the name of some kind of plant.
Palmate leaves.
Found everywhere except for Bavel.
Okay, so it's some kind of a particular plant. Umide pashke rabbe. And ve'al pum chanuta midalan yate. So he says that where do these things grow? They grow in marshes, and they would put them in front of stores, and because the branches would hang down and give people shade and a nice smell for people to sit there. Omi partziduhe avde mishcha, and they would make from its seeds. They would make oil. Uba'anpoi naichan kol b'richei demarva. And all of the sick people of the West, meaning all of the sick people in Israel, would rest underneath its branches. So in other words, it was a plant that had a lot of positive things to it. You could get oil from it. You could sit under its branches. It had a good smell, and it gave good shade. So this is just a description of the kikayon that's described in the story of Yonah. That's all.
These all arguments about kik, or is the kik bird really?
There are three different theories about what does shemen kik mean. Is shemen kik the oil that comes?
Might be all wrong.
Could be, I guess. Yeah. So they're theorizing.
That you could not use. Yeah, that's the interesting.
Right. They're theorizing about which one of these, which one of oils this is, which oil this actually is, what the source is. And then it just sort of digressed for a moment to talk about the kikayon of Yonah, which could be the source of the shemen kik. Amar Rabba Rabba said, "Petilot shemru chachamim ein madikin behen b'Shabbat mipnei she'or misachsechet behen." When the rabbis identified certain wicks that could not be used for Shabbat candles, it was because the flame jumps around on them, doesn't stick properly on them. And the oils that the Chachamim prohibited for use on Shabbat are because they are not drawn after the wick properly. So each one has its defect. The wicks are problematic because they don't hold the flame, and the oils are problematic because they don't flow properly on the wick. Let's say you would take one of these oils that's prohibited in the Mishnah. Okay, it's one of these oils that's prohibited in the Mishnah to use, but you mix in a little olive oil. So we know olive oil is good. So can you dilute it? In other words, can a mixture be used? Does the fact that one of these oils is present invalidate the whole thing? Or can we create a hybrid of the two? Do we say a gezerah In other words, everybody agrees that if you were to put this like olive oil together with one of these oils, it would work. So the question is, do we make a gezerah, do we make a decree that if we allow you to do that, then you're going to come to use one of the prohibited oils by itself?
Wait, it would work, meaning that it would be drawn properly?
It would be drawn properly. So right, if you mixed olive oil in, it would work. Yeah.
Okay.
So Amar le en madikin. He said, we don't do it. What's the reason? The fish en madikin, because we don't do it. That's it. Okay, very good answer. There is an objection. The Tanna Kama said, if you wrap something that you're allowed to use for a wick around something that you're not allowed to use for a wick, you can't use it. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says that Shel Beit Abba, Amar Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, Shel Beit Abba hayu korachin petila al gabe egoz umadikin. In my family, they would wrap a wick that was a kosher wick on a nut and light it. Okay, so what do you see then? Katani miyad madikin. So you see that according to Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, even though you've combined something that is viable or acceptable for a wick with something that's not acceptable, you can still use it. Amar lei ademotav li mi Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel sayinu miditana kama. Why are you focusing on the latter half of that statement where Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel is permissive? What about the opening line that says you can't do it? The opening line said you can't wrap something that's kosher for a wick around something that's not kosher and use it. So then Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel comes along and says, no, in my family we did that. But still, what about the main view? The main view is you can't do that. So the answer is, hala kashyam maserav. No, because actual implementation is very significant. Maserav means the fact that he did it precedent is very significant. So therefore we see that one can take a cloth that would be acceptable as a wick and wrap it around the nut and use it. Mikol makom kashya. Nonetheless, no matter what, it's still a problem. In other words, what do we see here? That even though when Abaye asked Rabbah said absolutely not. You cannot combine a kosher substance for lighting with a non-kosher substance for lighting. It doesn't work that way. You can't wrap, so that would mean you can't use one of these oils, an admixture of a kosher oil with a non-kosher oil, and it would also mean you can't use an admixture of a kosher wick with a non-kosher wick.
Is it not a wick substance?
It's being used.
Is it being used?
It's being used as part of the wick. That's what the assumption
is,
right? That's what the assumption is. So we go from Kashiel. My love lahadlik. You're assuming that what Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel meant was that he would use that nut inside the wick as part of the wick. That's not true. He says lo lehakpot. He just put that in to float the wick as a floater. Do you know how you put a floater when you put the wick in? You put a floater. It was a floater. So that's okay. So what Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel was saying was that even though you're not allowed to combine substances, kosher and non-kosher substances for the wick, you can definitely have a floater that's not necessarily capable or proper as a wick. You can use as a floater any material. In my family, we used to use a nut as a floater in the oil. So that, he says, is okay. All right, that's the way that Rashi is interpreting the word lahakput.
I'm confused.
Yeah.
Are they talking about the wick or
Why
are
are you
they talking
confused?
about the oil?
Nut.
Now they're talking about the wick, but it's the same idea. If you can't, in other words, the question is, are combinations allowed? So Abaye asked Rabbah, are combinations allowed? He said no.
And it's assumed that...
And wick and oil would be the same.
Would be the same.
They're assuming the same. That combinations won't be allowed. So lahakpot, according to the other interpretation that's brought, is that lahakpot, the Rashi is interpreting lahakpot means to float as a floater. There are others that say that lahakpot means to thicken the wick, not to be the actual wick, but to widen it so that the flame will be wider because it'll give it more body, even though what's really catching on fire is going to be the wick itself. But since it's wrapped in this nut, it will make it a little bit wider. But Rashi is saying it means to float it. Okay? So, so then you're going to have a problem, because if the whole question here is whether you can use a floater, why does the Tanna Kama say you can't use the nut to float the wick? What's the problem? Kula Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel. Really, that statement, the entire statement there that we quoted, is missing a piece. Really, it's all Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel. This is what it should say. Everybody agrees that if you wanted to make a wick out of substances that are acceptable and unacceptable, you can't do it. That's only if you want to make a wick out of those substances. But to float is okay. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel Omer, because Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel said, Shel Beit Abba hayu korchin petila al gabe egoz, because Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel brought as a precedent from his family that they would put the wick to float on a nut, and that was acceptable. So we see then that it actually supports Rabban, not refuting him, because it agrees that you can't combine in the wick itself an unacceptable and an acceptable substance, but you can float the wick with an unacceptable substance. Is that true? V'amar Rav Barona, Amar Rav. Rav Barona said that Rav said chelev mehutach v'kirbei dagim shenimochu adam noten letochan shemen kol shehu madik, that if you had the innards of fish, or you had chelev, you had fat. Now remember, fat or lard is one of the things you can't use as an acceptable oil. Okay? So he says you can put a little bit of oil in it, and it's okay. So if you melted down fat, he says chelev mehutach. Chelev is one of the things in the Mishnah that you're not allowed to use. Chelev, fat of an animal. So he says if you melt down the fat and you put in a little bit of oil, olive oil, you can use it.
That's just certain fats. Is any fat?
We're talking about animal fat,
right.
Lard. So it's one of the things that the Mishnah says you can't use, okay. Right? So now it's but we see from here for Shabbat candles, you cannot. It's one of the things you can't use. So now the Gemara is saying, so in this statement though, Rav Barona said that you can take olive oil, mix it with the lard, and use it. Okay, so that contradicts Rabbah. Rabbah said that you can't make a combination out of acceptable and unacceptable. Here we're saying that you can. So what's the problem? Because really, what does the Gemara answer? That what is prohibited in the Mishnah is chelev, not melted fat in a liquid form, but fat in a solid form is what's not allowed to be used for lighting candles. But when you melt it down, really it should be usable. When you melt down the fat, it should be usable. However, and these are not drawn after the wick. V'gazru Rabbanan al chelev meutach mishum chelev sheino meutach v'al kirbei dagim shenimochu mishum kirbei dagim shelo nimochu. In other words, really melted down innards of a fish or melted down fat should be a perfectly fine oil. But the problem is by themselves. But the problem is that they didn't want you to end up using unmelted fat or unmelted innards of fish, and so therefore they said you can't use it when it's melted down because they didn't want you to come to use it when it was in a solid state. So therefore. So why didn't they also prohibit it when you add olive oil? The answer is mishum chelev meutach. In other words, why didn't they say to themselves, just like we made a gezerah, we made a decree that you shouldn't use melted fat or melted fish innards because lest you come to use solid fat or solid fish innards, right? So why didn't they also prohibit when you mixed oil in? So the answer is hi gufa gezerah, because that itself is a gezerah. It was already a gezerah that you can't use melted because you might use solid. Now you're going to use a gezerah that you can't mix oil with the melted because then you might use the oil. Then you might use the fat that's melted without the oil. And then why can't you use the fat that's melted without oil? Oh, because you might use solid fat. So it's too many steps. We're not going to make a double gezerah. It's already one gezerah. So since in this case, really the main thing that's prohibited is solid fat, and the idea that you can't use the melted liquid fat is already a gezerah. It's already an extra safeguard. So now make another safeguard that you can't use it even when it has olive oil mixed in. Because maybe you'll use it by itself. And you can't use it by itself because maybe you'll use it in a solid state. That's too many steps removed, and we're not going to go that far. And that's why in other cases where the thing itself is not good, in other words, in other oils, where the oil itself is problematic already, there we say a gezerah that you can't mix it with oil because you might use it by itself. But that's where it's one step. But here we're saying that really what was prohibited was the solid. The liquid would actually have been fine. That was only prohibited by a gezerah. And now you're going to make another gezerah. That's too many gezerot for us to handle. Tane, they taught, Rabbi Bar Chama taught the following. Pitilot u'shmanim shamru chachamim en madlikin ben b'shabbat and madlikin ben b'mikdash. Any kinds of wicks or oils that the rabbi said you can't use on Shabbat, you can't use in the Beit HaMikdash, mishum shenemar lahalot ner tamid. Because it says in the Torah, lahalot ner tamid, that you want the candle to burn continuously. and that means you want it to burn well, and you need to use good oil and good wicks. He said the teaching, and he explained the teaching. What does it mean, lahalot ner tamid, that you should raise the fire continuously, or raise the candle continuously? What it means is that the flame should sustain itself and not require any additional assistance. So therefore you have, just like on Shabbat, we want to have a flame that is a flame that's self-sustaining and doesn't require any assistance. When it comes to the menorah, we want the same. Now what's the obvious problem? So that Rabbi Akiva Eger asks on the side, it's a very obvious problem. You can only use olive oil in the menorah of the Beit HaMikdash. So what does he mean? Any oils that the rabbis prohibited, you can't use in the menorah. The only thing you can use is olive oil. So what's a chidush? So you could say that he was just speaking. I think that the simplest way to understand it, without getting into pilpulim, is what he meant was petilot. He was really focused on the wicks. He just used the language of shmanim petilot, because obviously the oils that the rabbis prohibited for Shabbat are not allowed in the menorah, because you can only use olive oil anyway. But the main point is that the wicks, because the Torah doesn't specify what kind of wick has to be used in the menorah, and so he's saying that the same standard of using a wick that's going to work well applies in the Beit HaMikdash, just like it applies on Shabbat. Tanan, we also learned that they used to take the pants that were worn out of the Kohanim. The Kohanim, they would have pants, or they would have their belts, the avnetim, that would wear out, and they would make wicks from which they would light candles on the Simchat Beit HaShoeva. The Simchat Beit HaShoeva was the partying during Sukkot, and they had candles everywhere, and it was a really huge celebration. So they would take these worn out garments of the Kohanim and make them into the wicks for this lighting. Now, why did they bring this? It said tanan, which would sound like it's bringing us support, but actually it's kind of a difficulty, because this would seem to contradict our what we're saying up till now. Because the materials because tzemer was used. We said that tzemer is one of the things. Wool is one of the things you're not allowed to make a wick out of, and the clothing of the Kohanim was made of tzemer. So how could it be, if you have wool clothing, and actually it was made of wool and linen together, but if you have these, if you have the wool in there, how could it be that that they used these items, or especially the belt? The belt was made out of wool and linen. The avnit of the Kohen, it was made of wool and linen. So you know that you're using wool to as a petilah, as a wick. When we said before that one of the things you can't use for a wick is the wool. So what does it say? Simchat Beit HaShoeva Shenei. That Simchat Beit HaShoeva is different, because that's not a deoraita. What they did in the Beit HaMikdash for Simchat Beit HaShoeva was not a mitzvah. It doesn't say in the Torah during Sukkot you should light candles and they should be burning lahalot ner tamid, to make a continual burning. It doesn't say that. That was just to beautify and to increase the festivities of the day. So that's why they were allowed to use wicks that weren't ideal. Tashma, come and listen to Tani Rabba Bar Matana. But Rabba Bar Matana said that they would take the worn out clothing of the Kohanim and they would make from them petilot, they would make from them wicks for the Beit HaMikdash. My love the kilayim, lo dibuts. So they said, doesn't that mean that you could actually use the kilayim? You could use the mix of wool and linen from the belt of the Kohanim. He says, no, all it's referring to is the linen part of the garment. And that is perfectly fine for wicks. Even for the menorah it would be good, because apparently linen is a perfectly good wick, and tzemer, wool, is an inferior wick. So they wouldn't use the threads from the Kohanim, from the garments of the Kohanim that were made of linen. That were made of wool. They would only use the threads that were made of linen, which were considered a perfectly fine wick, as we learned in the Mishnah, because the Mishnah mentioned that using the unprocessed flax was a problem. Right? But using the processed one is certainly okay. Wool, though, is not okay. So Amar Ravuna says, and this is now we get into the Sugya of Chanukah finally, which is a very famous Sugya. It's going to last a few pages, and it's very practical. So Ravuna says, Petilot u'shmanim shamru chachamim en madikin behen b'Shabbat en madikin behen b'Chanukah. That any wicks or oils that the rabbi said you can't use on Shabbat, you can't use on Chanukah. Ben b'Shabbat ben b'chol. Even during the weekday, on Shabbat and weekday, you can't use these things for Chanukah either. Why? Amar Rava says, Maita Amad Ravuna. What's the reason of Ravuna? Kasavar kabetaz zakukla umutar l'shtemesh l'ora. It's based on two principles. First of all, because Ravuna says that if the Chanukah light goes out, you have to relight it. That means you are responsible for ensuring that it burns the entire time. And if you're responsible for ensuring that it burns the entire time, that means you are responsible for choosing wicks and oils that are most likely to have a sustainable flame.
It sounds like the transition here is to show that because Hanukkah is not a biblical holiday.
That's true, but neither is Ner Shabbat. The main problem with the Shabbat candle is that they're worried that if you choose, that if you choose, because they use the Shabbat candle as their real light on Shabbat, so they were concerned not because of the mitzvah, the rabbinic mitzvah of lighting Shabbat candles. The concern was that you were going to come to play with the candle because it wasn't giving you a sufficient light, and they actually relied on the Shabbat candles for the source of light.
And if you were to play with the Hanukkah candle light, would that be a biblical prohibition?
No, not only on Shabbat. Obviously, on Shabbat, yes,
but not right. So then the comparison is something that's biblical versus rabbinical.
But we're going to see that. But wait a second, because we're going to see that there could be a case where it's also biblical. Because, for example, if you hold that you're allowed to make use of the candle on Chanukah, like Rav Huna says, okay, that's a machloket. So Rav Huna said that you're allowed to make use of it. Mutar l'shtemesh l'ora, you're allowed to. So that means on Shabbat you might actually make use of the candle. And if you chose a candle that wasn't good, you might tilt it.
Of the Hanukkah.
Because you're allowed, even the Chanukah candle. So there are two reasons. So in other words, there are two reasons why. Even on Chol, even on a weekday, he wants you to choose the best wicks and the best oils because kavita zakukla, because if it goes out, you're responsible for it. You need to make sure that it stays on the whole time. And you're responsible when it's Shabbat because since he holds you're allowed to make use of the light of the Chanukiah, if the light is insufficient, if it's flickery, you might come to adjust it, and then you'll be in big trouble. So that's Rav Huna's view. Rav Chisda says, "Madlikin ben b'chol avalo b'Shabbat." Rav Chisda says that yes, you can use it during the weekday. During the weekday, you could use whatever wicks and whatever oils you want. However, on Shabbat, you have to use the finest ones, the ones that are specified in our Mishnah as allowed. Kasavar kavita en zakukla mutar l'shtemesh l'ora. We turn to Amud Bet. This is because Rav Chisda holds that if it goes out, you're not responsible for it. If it goes out, you're not responsible for it. But so that means during the week we're not concerned. During the week we're not concerned because during the week, if it goes out, you're not responsible for it, so we don't mind that you used inferior oils or inferior wicks. But since he holds mutar l'shtemesh l'ora, that you're allowed to benefit from the light, so on Shabbat we're worried you might come to tilt the lamp. So he says on Shabbat, when you light for Chanukah, you have to use the same standard that you would for your Shabbat candles. On the weekday, we don't care. Amar Rav Zera, Rabbi Zera says, Amar Rav Matana, in the name of Rav Matana, V'amri la Amar Rabbi Zera, Amar Rav, and some say that Rabbi Zera said that Rav said, Petilot u'shmanim shamru chachamim madikin ben b'Shabbat, madikin ben b'Chanukah ben b'chol ben b'Shabbat. According to Rav, the wicks and the oils that we said you're not allowed to use on Shabbat, you can use them on Chanukah. Weekday or Shabbat, doesn't matter. Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah says, "My tamad Rav, what's Rav's reasoning? Kasavar kavita en zakukla va'asur l'shtemesh le'ora." The reason is because Rav says that when the light goes out, you're not responsible for relighting it. So no problem. It went out. Okay, it wasn't my problem. And asur l'shtamesh l'ora, you're not allowed to benefit from the candlelight of the Chanukiah. So on Shabbat, you're not going to be benefiting from it. And since you're not going to be benefiting from it, we're not concerned that you're going to tilt it. So that means you don't have to hold your Chanukiah up to such a high standard of wicks and oils, according to Rav, because you're not responsible for making sure that the flame persists even during the week. And we're not worried that you're going to tilt the lamp on Shabbat because you're not allowed to use it. The rabbis came and told Abaye this teaching of Rabbi Yirmiyah, and he didn't accept it. When Ravin came from Israel, Ravin brought it in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. The rabbis came and told Abaye in the name of Rabbi Yochanan that this was the halakha, and he accepted this report. In other words, he accepted the report that Rav said that you can use whatever wicks you want and whatever oils you want, because we're not concerned about it going out, and you're not allowed to benefit from it. Amar izakai gamirte lishmate meikara. He said, if only I learned this teaching earlier. Abaye wished he had learned it earlier. Vaha gemara, what difference does it make? He learned it now. What's the point worrying? Let bygones be bygones. Nafkamina legirsad diankuta, because we say girsad diankuta, that what you learn in your youth stays with you more than what you learn later in life, and it's better integrated with your other knowledge, because what you learned earlier on in life, you've worked through the implications, you've worked it through, you've connected it to other things that you know, you've built on it, so it's a more valuable piece of knowledge when you learned it earlier. What was the problem? So the Mefarshim explained that Abaye had a really hard time believing that asur, what we take for granted, which is asur l'shtamish le'ora, because we're used to the what is the normative halacha today, that you're not allowed to benefit from the Chanukiah. For Abaye, that was a very difficult concept, that there would be such a stringent prohibition. So he had difficulty accepting it in the beginning, but eventually when he heard that it came on reliable authority, he took it. Is it really true that if the Chanukiah blows out, that one does not have to relight it? Or a minhi, they raised an objection, mitzvata mishetishka chama ad shetichle regel min hashuk. It says that the mitzvah of the lights of Chanukah, the mitzvah goes from sunset until the foot is gone from the shuk. In other words, until people come home from work. When everyone has come home from work, or everyone has come home from the marketplace, then there's no more mitzvah. But what's the implication? It sounds like my lav de'i kavta hadar madlikla. Doesn't it sound like it means that if you light your Chanukiah at sunset, it needs to be lit until everybody's home from the marketplace, and if it goes out, you should have to relight it? That's what it sounds like. The Gemara answers, no, it's not true. De'i la adlik madlik. What it means is, if you didn't light it yet, but everyone hasn't come home from the marketplace, you can still light it. It doesn't mean that it has to burn the entire duration of time, and if it goes out, you have to relight it. What it means is, that's the window of time that you have. V'inami, alternatively, l'shiura. It doesn't mean that it has to burn the entire time. What it means is that you need to put enough oil in the candle that it could burn the entire time. But if it happens to be extinguished, that's not your problem. And that's really what the halacha is. If the Chanukiah goes out, one is not required to relight it. You could relight it if you want to, not on Shabbat obviously, during the week you could relight it, but it's not required. And the Tosafot brings here that many people already in their time were lax about the timing of lighting the Chanukiah, because nowadays we light them inside. It used to be that they lit them outside. So it was really for the passers-by to see. So you had to be worried, what time are people coming home? And if it's the middle of the night, nobody's walking on the street, so maybe nobody's going to see it. So they said nowadays when we light inside the house, it's not really a concern whether people are going to be walking back and forth outside.
But our rule for today about making sure that it burns at least a half hour after, that's not related to this.
That is related to this. That's the source for it.
So we are concerned that at least some people should be.
Yeah, it should be burning as long as it would have been burning, at that time. So since the window of time they gave was about a half hour.
Oh, they did give that short.
Well, the Rishonim. Nowadays there are many contemporary rabbis who argue that nowadays it should be longer, because in those days, rush hour, how far did people travel to go to work? 5 minutes. They walked as far as they could walk. It wasn't very far. So once nightfall came, they had to be relatively close to home. Nobody was commuting an hour. Nowadays, rush hour is like 3 hours. So a lot of people said, really, and if you take it really literally, until everybody's home. If you live in New York City, you have to do it all day, all night.
Is that 24/7?
Right, it's going to be all night. So a city that never sleeps. So, but we go by, certainly those of us who light inside the house don't have to make it light for an extremely long period, because we're not really showing it to the outside. If you are showing it to the outside, then you should try to do it for as long as possible, so that as many people as possible do see it. I'm sorry, I skipped the part. So, what does it mean until the foot is gone from the marketplace? How long is that? Amar Rabba Bar Bar Chana. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Rabba Bar Bar Chana said, Rabbi Yochanan said, actually, Dechaliyah Regla de Tarmuda'eh, until the foot of the Tarmuda'eh is gone. This was a group that was the last. They were the stragglers in the marketplace. Apparently, according to Rashi, they would sell people firewood to bring home to light in their homes when they went at the end of the day. So they were the ones who would stand out there when everybody was going home to sell the firewood to people who were heading home. So they were the last ones to close up shop. So that was considered the end of the Shuk day for that day. Tan Rabbanan, the Rabbi taught mitzvah Chanukah, ner ish uveto, that the candle of Chanukah, the mitzvah is one man, one candle, and a house. In other words, one candle per household. That's the mitzvah. V'ameadrin, those who were careful to pursue excellence in mitzvot. Beit Shammai Omrim, Beit Shammai says, ner l'kol echad v'echad, would have a candle for each member of the household. That means if you have 2 people living, you have 2. If you have 10 people in your house, you have 10 candles, and so on. V'amehadrin min hamehadrin, those who are the exceptional of the exceptional. Beit Shammai Omrim, Beit Shammai says, Yom Rishon madlik shmona mikan ve'elach pochit ve'holech, that you start with 8 candles on the first night, and each night you reduce. Beit Hillel Omrim, Yom Rishon madlik achat mikan ve'elach mosif ve'holech. And of course, Beit Hillel says the way that we do it, which is you start with 1 candle on the first night, and you increase each subsequent night. Amar Ula says, Pligi batrei amora'eh b'ma'arava. Yeah. What do you want to say? So there were 2 Amoraim who disagreed about the reason behind this in the West. The West is Israel. Rabbi Yossi bar Ravin, Rabbi Yossi bar Zeveda. Rabbi Yossi bar Ravin, Rabbi Yossi bar Zeveda. We could see why they got which one was which confused, because they had the same first name. So that's why I said Chad Amar. One of them said, they couldn't remember which one said which explanation, because they're both Rabbi Yossi. So Chad Amar, Tamad Beit Shammai keneged yamim v'nechnasim, v'tamad Beit Hillel keneged yamim v'yotzein. That according to Beit Shammai, we follow the days that are coming in. In other words, how many days are left? How many days are left? It's a countdown. So it's 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. It's a countdown. Okay? According to Beit Hillel, it's a count up. The days that are passing is what we count. V'chad Amar, the other one says, Tamad Beit Shammai keneged parei hachag. V'tamad Beit Hillel d'malin b'kodesh v'in moridin. That the reasoning of Beit Shammai is like the parei hachag, the korbanot of Sukkot, that every day the number of parim, the number of bulls that was offered is reduced. So too, Chanukah is like a type of Sukkot. It's a festival of Thanksgiving also. In fact, according to the Sefer HaMakkabim, one of the reasons why they made Chanukah 8 days was because they missed Sukkot that year, because the Beit HaMikdash was under siege and it wasn't in their possession. So it was kind of a makeup for Sukkot. So it's modeled after that. So the reduction in the starting with a large number and reducing is reminiscent of Sukkot. Beit Hillel says we agree that every day you have to change the number, but we never reduce. We always go malin bakodesh. We always increase in number. So what is the difference between these two? The difference is obviously that the first explanation has it that each day the number has a significance. The number has a significance. You're starting with the number of days. You're either counting up the number of days that's passed, or you're counting down the number of days that are coming up. Right? So you go 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, or 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So each day, if you see the number, you know the number has a meaning. If you see 5 in the house of Beit Hillel, you know that means it's the 5th night. In the house of Beit Shammai, you know
both achieve that, exactly. In other words,
right.
So both would be okay.
Well, we go with Beit Hillel, but I'm just saying, there are 2 different interpretations here of what the reasoning is. Is the reasoning about the number of days, either the increase in days or the counting down of days, or is the reason something else? The other reason that's given is that Beit Shammai says, no, you reduce because the parei hachag, because the korbanot of Sukkot would reduce, and you increase according to Beit Hillel because malin bakodesh. But according to that, there's no significance to the number. Because according to the second explanation, all you're doing is changing the number each day, and Beit Hillel says, I recommend you increase, and Beit Shammai says, no, I recommend you decrease the number. But they're not saying, according to the second explanation, that the specific number on a given day really has any meaning.
So what if Beit Shammai counter Beit Hillel by saying that on Sukkot we decrease the parim?
Yeah, right.
I was thinking that it was the number 8 is important because that's the days that it lasts. So the number that you're shooting for matters. It's not just the number of Sukkot Karbanos. And that Beis Shammai was marking the potential of the miracle. There's more miracle power around because it's going to last for 8 more days. Right. So we go up. So we go down.
Right.
Greater miracle power at the beginning, and Beis Hillel was the opposite.
What the actual
was every day.
That's true, but that's only according to the first interpretation of the machloket. There's actually 2. That's the conventional interpretation that everybody says over.
Right.
But there are actually 2 interpretations. There are actually 2 interpretations, and in fact, What's very interesting is, so Tosafot says on the side that it doesn't make any sense that we have multiple Chanukiot and we also increase each night. Right? That's what he says.
Either one or the other.
Right. He says because if you're going to go like the first, so he says because if you look in somebody's house on the fourth night, let's say you look in and there are two people living in the house, you're going to see 8 candles. So you're going to be confused. Is it the fourth night and there were 2 people? Is it the 8th night and there's 1 person? Is it the second night and there are 4 people? How are you going to be able to tell? Yeah, because they would just put their candles. They didn't have they didn't go to a Judaica store and buy a Chanukiah. They just put candles. So that you would just see a number of candles. So you wouldn't know. So that's why Tosafot says that we should have only one. If we're going to go like Beit Hillel and we're going to increase that based on the number, we should have just 1 Chanukiah, and that's the Sephardic custom that we just have 1 Chanukiah. But the Rambam, this is an irony because this is one of only 2 places that I know of where the Sfaradim follow the Tosafot and the Ashkenazim follow the Rambam. So there's only one other case where they do that, which is that I know of, which is saying Borei Priya Geffen 4 times on the 4 cups of the Seder, instead of just the first and the third, which is the Sephardic custom. So that's the only other place that I know where they reverse. So a very cogent explanation though. So how then does the Rambam explain this problem? I mean, if on the first night you see 10 candles, you don't know, are there 10 people living there? Is it the 5th night and there are 2 people? How do you know? If you're going to increase based on both on the number of people in the house, you're going to have the number of people in the house represented, and you're going to increase every night, so the number is going to have no meaning. So what's the answer? The Rambam must maintain, like the second interpretation of the Machloket. In the second interpretation of the Machloket, increasing each night is not because of the number. It's just because you want to change each night, and rather than change by reducing, we want to change by increasing. But in the second version of the Machloket, Beit Hillel doesn't say the first night is because it's day 1, we do 1 candle. The second night, day 2, we do 2 candles. He just says Malin Bakodesh. We want to increase. In other words, it's not the specific night, it's the progression over time of an increase.
You could be increasing by 2s or 3s.
You could be increasing by 10s. You could be increasing by hundreds. So that's why, as long as you're increasing. So the Rambam held like the second interpretation of the Machloket, that you're increasing, it doesn't matter what increment you increase by because the number is not important. The increase over time, the progression is what's important. That's not the conventional view that the number represents the day.
So given that,
right?
Is there real evidence that the 8 days is really 8 days? That the 8 days is a miracle, that it lasted 8 days?
Yeah, that we know for sure.
We know that.
That's part of the story, yeah.
We do know that.
Right, that's for sure. We're just here discussing, because that's why the holiday is 8 days, for sure.
Nobody, do you know anybody that uses the word Beit Shammai?
What? Beit Shammai? Wait, no. Nobody
Why
does
did
Beit
they
Shammai.
slip in the number of kabbanos from Sukkot?
Because in the first view, they're trying to interpret Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel that the number on each day has a significance. So either you're counting down or you're counting up. In the second interpretation, they're saying it's not the individual night that has significance, it's progression over time, because we don't want each night to be the same. So there should be a progression over time. So then the question is, do we have a model for progressing over time? Well, Beit Hillel is easy because, of course, increasing over time makes sense. So then they had to explain, how will Beit Shammai explain a progression that's a reduction? So they say, we do have a precedent for that on Sukkot. A progression that's a reduction could also be valid progression.
According to Beit Hillel, if you have a family that lights multiple menorot, you'd have to continue that multiple lighting, even if one family member wasn't there.
There that night, right? That would be the consistency according to the Rambam for sure. According to the Rambam, by the way, people also do this wrong according to the Rambam because they misunderstood the Rambam. Many people, and they thought that the Rambam meant that each individual is supposed to light their own Chanukiah. That's not what he says. He says that you're supposed to have a number of candles representing the number of people in the house. In other words, really, the Rambam says the Bal Habayit lights the number of candles of the number of people. He doesn't say that each person lights their own. So even when they're not there, if you have 10 kids and they're all sleeping over their friend's house that night, you would still light the 10 candles because it's the number of people in the household, not the number of people there on that particular day, or the number of people lighting. So that's the explanation. So Amar Rabbi Bar Chana said, Amar Rabbi Yochanan said, Shnei Zekinim hayu b'Tzidon, echad asake Beit Shammai ve'echad asake Divrei Beit Hillel, that there were 2 elders in Sidon. One did like Beit Shammai, one did like Beit Hillel. So here you go, Sammy. There's somebody doing like Beit Shammai, but this was 2,000 years ago. Zenoten tam lidvarav. One of them gave the reasoning keneged parei hachag. That's a nice support for the Rambam's assuming that that's the definitive explanation, and not the conventional one, which is so ironic, because the conventional one that's so much easier for people to understand, that's repeated all the time, is not really the one that they adopted. They adopted the reasoning that, it's reduction or increase. It's not about the particular day. Really? What?
What's the end of the Sipur of the Shneskim?
Nothing. That was his whole story. He was just saying that they adopted the reasoning, the latter reasoning, not the former reasoning. The first reasoning had to do with the number of days, and the second reasoning had to do with just increase, not necessarily the number of days. When they explained themselves, they explained it based on increase and reduction, not based on the number of days coming in or the number of days that passed. He's just saying that was the reasoning that they used. So now it's a mitzvah to put it on the outside of the door. What if you live in an apartment? Then you should put it in the window that faces the street. In the times of danger, at that time you place it on your table and it's good enough. In other words, when you're in danger, in the times of the Persians, that there were days that they didn't allow people to have lights in their house, so they would put it on the table. Rava said, a person has to have another candle inside the house to use, because after all, in those days they used candlelight, and since you can't use the Chanukiah, you have to have another candle there. If a person has a fireplace, lo tzarich, then he doesn't need an extra candle. That's the shamash. But if you're an adam chashuv, if you're important, an important person would not read by the light of a fireplace. He would always have a lamp that he's using for his practical needs. So that person would need some kind of a shamash, some kind of an extra candle there, so that he doesn't use the light of the Chanukiah. Nowadays, many people have already pointed out that given that we have electric lights, we don't really need a shamash anymore. The reason we put a shamash is symbolic, to sort of show that we don't use the light of the Chanukiah. But essentially, you don't really need a shamash because we have lights in your house today. And the only reason for the shamash was that you should not use the light of the Chanukiah, and you should have an extra light for your use. But you see that the halacha isn't. So the Gemara could have said that you're not allowed to use the light of the Chanukiah, and of course you have to have another candle. Of course you do. If you're not allowed to use that light, what are you going to do? But the fact that it tells you v'tzarich ner acheret means it's a mitzvah to put it. Let's say a person says, I'm not gonna use the Chanukiah light, I'm gonna go to sleep. Still, it's a mitzvah to put an extra light that's for your personal use to demonstrate that you're not using the Chanukiah. It's not just a practical thing. The Gemara doesn't have to give you practical advice. Oh, by the way, since you can't use the Chanukiah, you ought to get a flashlight. It doesn't have to tell you that. Practical advice. So why is it telling you practical advice? Because it's a mitzvah. You need to put a shamash to demonstrate that you're not allowed to use the Chanukiah. Nowadays, technically, the electric lights would work, but most people put a shamash in.
So in the Talmud days, in a house, whatever a house was like, this one candle
would be on the doorway.
The Hanukkah candle.
Right.
Would be on the door. Yeah.
They would put it outside.
If you go to Yerushalayim, you can see how they have,
and they put it in a little
box outside.
Right.
So inside the house, when we were talking about inside the house,
right,
there would be one candle. That's what I was getting at. How do you live with one candle? What kind of light do you get from one candle?
Well, if it's dark and they don't have electric lights, there would be a lot.
That would be a real thing. Okay.
Yeah, there'd be a lot. Now, so now, interestingly, there's also a machloket about if a person lives, what is the requirement? Is the requirement that the Chanukiah face the Reshut HaRabim, or is the Chanukiah is the idea that it has to be at the house? So there's one view that says if they in the Chatzerot they had to put the Chanukiah at the outside of the Chatzer, the courtyard, not outside the house. So it's a machloket Rishonim where they were supposed to put it, right outside the door. So if you live in a courtyard, do you live in it? Because in the old days, that's what they had. They had these enclosed courtyards. Should everybody put their Chanukiah at the door of the courtyard that faces the Reshut HaRabim, the actual public area, or should each person put it at their door? Right. But the question is, does it have to be near your house, or can you put it at the Chatzar?
beyond the party.
Right. So that's the question. Now, but it's a machloket. Okay, so my Chanukah. What is Chanukah? So the Gemara is asking, what is the story? The rabbis taught the Chafei b'Kislev Yomei the Chanukah Timanyan Inun that on the 25th of Kislev it's the days of Chanukah. There are 8 of them. That you can't eulogize on them, and you can't fast on them. Because when the Greeks came in, they defiled all of the oils that were in the sanctuary. And when the house of Chashmonai prevailed upon them, but they found only one vial of oil, which we know the story, which was sealed with the seal of the Kohen Gadol, and it only had enough to light for one day. There was a miracle that they lit from it for 8 days. The following year, they made it a holiday with Halil and Hoda'ah, with thanking of Hashem and Halil. So we all know the story. It says there that if a person is hammering and a spark goes forth and causes a fire and causes damage, he's responsible for it. Gamal sheta'un pishtan. Let's say there's a camel that's walking by, and this camel is carrying flax on its back. Vehu over b'reshut harabim, and he's going through a public domain. And this flax enters, in other words, because it's hanging over the sides of this gamal, it's hanging over the sides of this camel, it protrudes into a storefront. And the store owner's candle is inside the store, and this flax catches on fire. So what happens? And then, so basically the driver of the camel doesn't realize that his flax is on fire. Because accidentally the flax went into protruded into somebody's storefront, got caught on fire. The camel driver is just going along, doesn't realize, and he ends up lighting a whole house on fire, burning it down. So what happens? Bala gamal chayav. It's the camel driver's fault. Why? Because he shouldn't have allowed his flax to be protruding into somebody's storefront. So he's responsible for that. Okay? However, if the store owner had put his candle outside, then it's the store owner's fault. You're not allowed to put a candle in the public domain, and everyone has the right to travel in the public domain. And if somebody's stuff catches on fire, and even if they carry that fire somewhere else, it's your fault. You shouldn't have had a fire in the public domain. However, Rabbi Yehuda Omer b'ner Chanukah patur. If it was the ner Chanukah, then he's exempt. In other words, if the store owner puts his candle outside because of Ner Chanukah, Rashi says, Chenvani, shebereshut pirsum mitzvah ini chasham. Because he did it with the permission of publicizing the miracle. So therefore, since he was doing a mitzvah, we don't hold him liable, and we hold the Bala Gamal, really, the owner of the camel should be a lot more careful because he knows it's Chanukah, and he shouldn't allow the pishtan, he shouldn't allow this flax to hang over and get caught on fire. But basically the point is that the Chenvani, at the very least the Chenvani, we can blame the camel driver here, but we don't have to. The point is that the store owner won't be liable because he put his candle outside with permission, the permission of the mitzvah. This is, by the way, the only place in the entire Mishnah where the word Chanukah is mentioned. Only once in all of the entire Mishnah. The Mishnah was written in the year 200. In the Mishnah, that we're learning the Talmud. In all of Mishnayot, it never mentions Chanukah except one place. This is the Gemara. The Gemara talks about the detail. Right.
So there is no Masekhet.
No. This is
Masekhet Megillah.
Right, because that's a lot. There's a lot more halachot in it. All of the halachot of Chanukah are on these few pages of Gemara that we're doing right now. But it's in Gemara. It's mentioned in the Mishnah only once, and only in a case of damages in Bava Kama when it talks about the camel driver who gets his flax on fire. But what does it show you? It shows you that certain halachot, like the Rambam says, were so well known. The Mishnah didn't have to explain it. Everybody knew what Chanukah was. But by the time they got to the Gemara, they had to flesh out the details a little bit more, and that's what we're seeing now. So then the Gemara says, Amar Ravina says, Zot omeret ner Chanukah mitzvah lanicha b'toch 10. That this also shows you that you need to put the candle within 10 tefachim of the ground. It can't be very high up. You can't put your ner Chanukah up by the ceiling. It should be at a normal distance from the ground. How can you infer that? Because the because if you were allowed to place your ner Chanukah that high, you could place it very high. Then we could say to the store owner, listen, I understand that you wanted to put your candle outside, but for God's sake, could you please put it a little bit higher than the average person who's driving a camel so they don't end up knocking it over or catching things on fire? And then we could still blame the store owner. So what must we conclude? It must be that it has to be low. It has to be low. He had no choice. And since he had no choice but to do the mitzvah that way, we can't blame him for putting his candle there. The Gemara says, no, that's not a proof. It's not a proof because v'dilma maybe we can't really infer definitively that you must put your ner Chanukah within 10 tefachim of the ground. Why not? Because we could say that the rabbis just didn't want to put a burden on a person and require them to put it so high, because it would be difficult for the store owner to place it so high that it was out of harm's way, so to speak. And that's why we allowed the store owner some flexibility. You can't prove from this Mishnah that necessarily you have to put the candle low. You can't prove it. It happens to be true that you're supposed to, but you can't prove it because it could be that we just don't put a burden on the store owner and require him to put it very high. Now later on the Gemara is going to explain to us in the very next piece that in fact it has to be within a certain range of height, and the ideal is that it be about 10 tefachim from the ground, because that's sort of like the level where people are going to see it. But you can't prove from the Mishnah absolutely that you must put it there, because it could be that the only reason we give the chenvani a break, we say to the store owner, okay, you did the mitzvah by putting it outside, and we're not going to require you to get on the ladder and put it really, really high. That's too much to ask of somebody. So within reason, you did the mitzvah, and therefore you're not liable for damage that is incurred as a result. Have a great day, everybody.